This morning, Moscow woke up to something the government did not anticipate, a silence more powerful than protest. Across university campuses, from St. Petersburg to Kazan, students began walking out of lectures simultaneously. Not in anger, not waving signs, but in quiet synchronization, as if guided by an invisible signal. Within an hour, images flooded social media, empty auditoriums, professors talking to vacant rows, hallways filled with the murmur of footsteps leaving. The official response came quickly, uncoordinated acts influenced by foreign agents. But insiders admit this was no foreign operation. It was something far more unsettling, Russia's own youth, rejecting the system that raised them. For years, the Kremlin viewed this generation as politically harmless, too distracted, too digital, too distant from history to challenge authority. Yet in these hours, that perception is collapsing. According to sources close to the presidential administration, intelligence analysts have been warning for months of a structural breakdown of generational loyalty. The phrase, bureaucratic in tone, hides something more human. The young have stopped believing in the story of their country. They don't hate us, said one official privately. They just don't need us. That quiet indifference, more than anger, now haunts the corridors of power. In Moscow, police were deployed to major campuses before noon, though no laws had been broken. Students were neither protesting nor chanting. They were simply gathering, sitting on curbs, sharing phones, recording short clips of the moment when fear finally lost its hold. "We're not here to fight," said one young woman outside Bauman University. "We're here to be seen." That statement spread faster than any official denial. Within hours, it became a kind of slogan, whispered, reshared, repeated. "We're here to be seen." A phrase that the state, built on invisibility and obedience, doesn't know how to answer. The government's immediate instinct was to deny the scale. State media reported minor disruptions, framing the events as isolated acts of confusion. But our sources inside several ministries describe growing unease. Internal memos reference youth contagion, a term used only once before, during the 2011 protests. It suggests a fear not of organization, but of imitation, that others will follow simply because they can. "They're not fighting authority directly," explained a political analyst close to the Kremlin. "They're ignoring it. That's more dangerous." Experts say this quiet rebellion has been building for years, beneath the surface of loyalty campaigns and patriotic education drives. The young grew up watching speeches about greatness while living with scarcity. They were told to be proud, but given little to hope for. And when propaganda failed to inspire, irony replaced belief. "They mock everything now," said a sociologist studying youth culture. "They laugh where their parents were afraid." That laughter, soft but contagious, is the sound of something shifting, a generation realizing that fear no longer defines them. By the middle of the day, the authorities still struggled to frame a coherent message. Calls for calm sounded hollow. Warnings about foreign influence went unanswered. "The system doesn't understand how to handle silence," one former government media strategist said. "It can only respond to noise." But the streets stayed quiet, and in that quiet, something irreversible began to take shape, a recognition that the power holding the country together no longer inspires awe. For viewers following this story, understand, what's unfolding now is not revolution in the old sense. It's something subtler, slower, but far more dangerous to an aging regime. The young aren't trying to overthrow anything. They're simply stepping away. And once a generation walks out, from classrooms, from institutions, from the story itself, no system, however strong, can force them back in. What happened next, just hours later, revealed how unprepared the Kremlin truly was for this new kind of defiance. By midday, the picture had grown clearer, and far more unsettling for those in power. Across Russia's major cities, the pattern repeated itself: students walking out, employees quietly resigning, young professionals deleting state-affiliated accounts and wiping patriotic slogans from their profiles. It wasn't coordinated, but it was synchronized, a rhythm of rejection that needed no leader. By this point, the Ministry of Internal Affairs had issued a formal statement, calling the incidents isolated behavioral deviations, yet police patrols doubled in the capital's university districts. According to a source within the ministry, the phrase used in internal communication was far more direct: "We are losing the youth." That phrase, repeated across departments, has since become a whisper of panic within the Kremlin. For decades, the system's stability relied on generational obedience, a quiet transfer of loyalty from fathers to sons, from teachers to students. But that chain has broken. "They've stopped inheriting fear," said one sociologist close to the government. And once fear stops passing down, the regime's timeline begins to shorten. What makes the current moment dangerous is not mass protest, but mass indifference. Young Russians are no longer debating the government's legitimacy, they're living as if it doesn't exist. They aren't burning flags or attacking institutions. They're just walking away, building parallel realities online and off, where the state's voice cannot reach them. In St. Petersburg, witnesses reported entire classrooms emptying during mandatory, patriotic briefings. Teachers were told to mark absences as technical error. In Ekaterinburg, students arrived at school wearing black, not as a statement, but as a gesture of quiet recognition. In Moscow, small clusters formed in cafes and courtyards, where conversations shifted from fear to fatigue, and from fatigue to quiet amusement. They think we're angry, one student laughed. We're just bored. It was a cruel kind of irony, the government mistaking detachment for stability, while detachment was precisely what made collapse inevitable. Meanwhile, propaganda outlets rushed to reassert control. Television channels launched special programs on youth patriotism, while influencers linked to the state began posting rehearsed videos about loyalty and duty. But the response online was brutal, thousands of mocking comments, sarcastic edits, and clips reversing the official message. They've lost the algorithm, said a digital media analyst. They used to control the narrative by flooding it. Now every message they push gets turned into a joke within minutes. The propaganda machine, once a weapon of dominance, has become a target of ridicule. And ridicule, in the eyes of experts, is the most corrosive form of dissent. Inside the presidential administration, frustration is mounting. Our sources confirm that a meeting this morning between senior advisors and the head of state media ended abruptly after a heated exchange over messaging strategy. They still believe this can be solved with slogans, said one participant afterward. They don't understand, the slogans are the problem. For young Russians, official language itself has lost all weight. Words like duty, honor, and stability now sound hollow, recycled from an era that no longer speaks to them. The gap between generations is no longer political, it's linguistic. And yet, the most alarming development for the Kremlin is not happening on the streets or screens, but in the institutions it once controlled completely. Military recruiters report unprecedented levels of draft evasion. State enterprises struggle to fill entry-level positions, as young specialists quietly emigrate or shift into freelance work abroad. Even within government offices, junior staff are leaving in silence, no statements, no complaints, just resignations sent by email. They're evaporating, said one senior bureaucrat. You wake up and they're gone. By early afternoon, it became clear that this isn't simply a generational drift, it's a withdrawal of legitimacy itself. The young no longer view power as sacred or necessary. To them, it's background noise, outdated, unfixable, irrelevant. That realization, experts warn, is far more destabilizing than open rebellion. Revolutions can be suppressed. Apathy cannot. They don't want to destroy the system, one insider admitted quietly. They just stopped participating in it. And it's that quiet absence, not chants, not riots, not banners, that has left the Kremlin staring into a void it doesn't know how to fill. What happens when an entire generation simply disconnects from authority? The answer began to unfold in Moscow streets just hours later, when the state tried to remind its youth who still ruled, and discovered that no one was listening anymore. By early afternoon, Moscow streets carried an unusual stillness, not fear, not unrest, but the faint tension of something changing beneath the surface. Police patrols lingered outside universities, their presence both symbolic and uncertain. Officers stood quietly beside armored vans, waiting for crowds that never came. It's strange, one officer was overheard saying. They're not breaking the law, they're just ignoring us. That quiet defiance has now become the defining tone of Russia's youth. They don't oppose the state through confrontation, they unmake it through absence. And that absence, multiplied by millions, is becoming unmanageable. Inside the Kremlin, this realization is spreading like panic disguised as discipline. Multiple sources confirm that internal discussions have shifted from containment to psychological stabilization. The new directive, restore faith, or at least simulate it. But faith is not a currency that can be printed. Over the years, the state traded too much of it for propaganda, coercion, and spectacle. Now, when it needs belief most, it finds only exhaustion. The youth have tuned out, said a senior official close to the administration. They no longer see us as the center of anything. In a country where power depends on visibility, invisibility is a death sentence. Across social networks, the shift is visible in tone. Once, political memes mocked authority playfully, now, they carry an undercurrent of dismissal. They've moved from irony to indifference, explained one sociologist monitoring youth discourse. It's no longer rebellion, it's detachment. And in a society built on the performance of loyalty, detachment is revolutionary. When the young stop pretending, said an analyst, the performance collapses for everyone. Yet the system still tries to perform. In an attempt to reclaim narrative, pro-government influencers were ordered to post videos emphasizing hope and unity. But the results were disastrous. Within hours, those videos were flooded with derisive comments and edited into satirical montages. They can't fight irony, a media strategist admitted. It's faster than censorship. For the first time, the machinery of control is being outpaced not by opposition, but by humor, spontaneous, merciless, and contagious. Meanwhile, the effects are beginning to seep into the country's institutions. In universities, professors are quietly rewriting their lectures, omitting the required patriotic segments. Some, out of fear, others, out of fatigue. You can't lecture about greatness, said one history teacher, when your students no longer believe in it. Even in workplaces tied to the state, young employees are refusing to participate in mandatory propaganda events. Attendance logs are doctored to conceal their absence, protecting managers as much as workers. It's mutual survival, one insider explained. Everyone is pretending for everyone else. The security services, however, are not laughing. A confidential report shared with regional administrations warns of a psychological contagion among the under-30 demographic. The document, seen by our correspondents, describes a growing ideological void and advises increased monitoring of youth sentiment. But experts inside the system admit privately that sentiment cannot be policed. We can track anger, one intelligence officer said. But how do you track emptiness? That emptiness, quiet, steady, expanding, is now the regime's greatest threat. And it's not confined to students. Soldiers completing their mandatory service, junior bureaucrats, young journalists, all express the same fatigue. They are no longer motivated by ideology, only inertia. They'll do their jobs, said a military psychologist, but without conviction. That's when systems start breaking, not from opposition, but from indifference. When loyalty becomes mere habit, even the smallest shock can undo it. By early afternoon, reports began circulating of a new kind of protest, one without slogans or banners. In Moscow's metro, groups of students stood silently in carriages, wearing plain white ribbons. No chants, no signs, just silence. The symbolism was unmistakable. The gesture spread online within minutes, reaching other cities before the authorities could respond. The police did not know how to classify it. It's not a rally, one officer said. It's just people standing. But to those watching, it was the first visible sign that the silence had become collective. For the Kremlin, this is the nightmare scenario, a movement that doesn't look like one, a rebellion without leaders, and disobedience without words. It cannot be negotiated with, infiltrated, or crushed. And as insiders quietly admit, fear cannot be restored once people realize they no longer need it. By this hour, Russia's youth have stopped asking what's allowed. They are asking a different question entirely: what comes after this? And though no one yet has the answer, that question alone, whispered in classrooms, cafes, and dormitories, marks the beginning of something power cannot contain. What unfolded next, as the state tried to reassert its control, revealed just how fragile that power had already become. By early afternoon, Moscow's ministries were in quiet disarray. Inside government buildings, meetings stretched endlessly, the same phrases repeated like mantras: stability, order, discipline. But everyone present knew those words had lost their meaning. One insider described the atmosphere as a storm under glass, panic restrained only by habit. The intelligence services had delivered their latest assessment: youth discontent was non-hierarchical, spontaneous, and ideologically undefined. In simpler terms, impossible to control. The old tools of suppression were useless here. There were no leaders to arrest, no slogans to ban, no headquarters to raid. The threat was everywhere and nowhere, carried in the way people spoke, or rather, in what they no longer said. On the streets, the quiet rebellion continued to spread. In Moscow's central squares, young people walked slowly, deliberately, holding nothing, chanting nothing. Police officers watched from a distance, confused. "There's no violation," one commander admitted into his radio. "But something's happening." That something, the refusal to perform fear, is what unnerves the system most. For decades, the state trained citizens to respond to pressure with panic, but this generation doesn't flinch. They've grown up under surveillance and propaganda, learning how to hide in plain sight. Now they're using that same discipline against the regime that taught it to them. By midday, the Kremlin's public response took on a strangely pleading tone. State news anchors urged young patriots to show maturity and not be misled by provocations. But even the delivery felt tired, as if the words were being read by people who no longer believed them. In contrast, social networks pulsed with quiet humor. A trending post read, "If silence is treason, we're all guilty." The phrase, half-joke, half-truth, began appearing on encrypted messaging channels and in graffiti near universities. It captured the spirit of the moment, a rebellion of calm. No slogans, no barricades, only the collective withdrawal of obedience. Inside universities, administrators tried to restore order through discipline. Students were threatened with expulsion, professors warned to report unusual behavior. But in private, even teachers whispered the same doubts as their students. "You can't punish half the country," said one lecturer. "And you can't scare those who've already stopped listening." In some institutions, faculty began quietly protecting their students, deleting attendance logs, erasing digital traces, shielding them from investigation. The state may still own the institutions, but it is losing the people inside them. Meanwhile, in the industrial districts, the echo of this youth defiance began to reach older generations. Laid-off workers, already disillusioned, started sharing messages of support online. "Our children are braver than we were," one post read. "Maybe they'll finish what we couldn't start." It was the first public hint of something deeper, solidarity forming across Russia's invisible fault lines. What began as a generational divide was turning into a shared exhaustion. The young have lost patience, the old have lost illusions, and the government, caught between them, has lost control of its own narrative. At the same time, quiet fractures appeared inside the ruling apparatus itself. Sources close to the presidential administration describe arguments breaking out between senior advisors. Some urge force, arrests, intimidation, curfews. Others warn that repression would only confirm the state's weakness. "If we start cracking down, we show we're afraid," one strategist said. "If we do nothing, we show we've already lost control." The president, according to multiple accounts, listened in silence. "He's waiting for fear to return," one participant later said. But fear doesn't return once it's gone. Economists, meanwhile, are sounding a different kind of alarm. With thousands of young professionals emigrating or refusing state employment, key sectors are beginning to hollow out. "They're unplugging themselves from the system," explained a financial analyst. "They don't want to overthrow it, they just want to live without it." That quiet exodus, both physical and psychological, may prove more destructive than protest. Because revolutions challenge power, withdrawals dissolve it. As the day wore on, Moscow appeared deceptively calm, traffic flowing, businesses open, the city humming as usual. Yet anyone who paid attention could sense the undercurrent. Conversations paused when the police walked by. News presenters smiled too brightly. Officials spoke in half-sentences. It was as if everyone knew something irreversible was happening, but no one dared name it aloud. "The silence feels heavier than words," said one journalist. "It's not protest. It's premonition. And that premonition is spreading. Across Russia's vast cities and quiet towns alike, people are beginning to realize that power is not lost in a single explosion, it leaks away quietly, through laughter, through indifference, through the slow erosion of belief. The question haunting those in authority now is not how to restore order, but whether the people still think order matters at all. Because in the heart of Moscow, even as the lights remain bright and the cameras roll, the most dangerous sound is no longer shouting or applause. It is the collective silence of a generation that has stopped listening, and in that silence, the echo of a future the Kremlin can no longer command. By early afternoon, the tension in Moscow had reached a strange equilibrium, a calm so complete it felt rehearsed. The government was speaking louder than ever, yet no one was answering. Streets that once echoed with patriotic parades now seemed detached from the rhythm of power. The youth gatherings continued, not as demonstrations, but as quiet rituals of presence. In one square near the Polytechnic University, dozens of students stood together in silence, looking straight ahead as police vans idled nearby. No one moved. No one spoke. The officers, uncertain, eventually left. "They're not doing anything," one of them muttered, "but somehow, it feels like they've already won." Inside the Kremlin, that same realization was dawning. Sources tell us that the latest intelligence reports describe the situation as a low-grade civil fracture. It is not rebellion in the conventional sense, but the erosion of psychological obedience, a mass refusal to care. For a system built entirely on control, that is collapse by another name. "We can survive anger," said one senior official. "We can't survive disconnection." The administration has begun quietly rotating regional governors, reshuffling media officials, searching desperately for someone who can reconnect with the youth. But the problem is not communication. It's conviction. The young no longer believe in the state story, and once belief fades, every message becomes just noise. Meanwhile, within the universities and cultural centers, a quiet sense of freedom has begun to take shape, fragile, unspoken, but real. Teachers who once repeated the official narrative now skip those parts of their lectures. Musicians banned from performing abroad have started hosting small underground shows. Independent journalists, long silenced, are returning to online spaces where the audience is suddenly hungry again. The state still controls the airwaves, but it has lost the conversation. They can shut down channels, one young reporter said, but they can't shut down our minds. Even among loyal officials, doubt is spreading. A mid-level bureaucrat described it this way: "We look out the window and realize the people outside aren't listening anymore. They're not afraid, they're not angry, they're just gone." The disappearance is both physical and moral. Emigration has accelerated, yes, but so has an internal exodus, millions choosing to live emotionally outside the system while still inside its borders. The government remains in power, but it rules over absence. You can't govern silence, a political scientist observed. You can only pretend it isn't there. For years, Putin's rule depended on a delicate illusion, that time itself stood still in Russia, that tomorrow would always resemble yesterday. But this illusion is cracking. The young, born into his era, are beginning to imagine a country beyond it. Not with slogans or revolts, but with small, daily acts of withdrawal, a refusal to participate in fear. "They taught us to obey," said one student, "and now we're obeying differently. We're obeying ourselves." By the middle of the day, the news cycle returned to routine: government meetings, speeches, assurances. Yet behind those images, something irreversible had already occurred. A new generation had quietly stepped out of the frame. The state still performs its role, but the audience has left the theater. And no amount of applause from the few who remain can disguise the empty seats. For those watching closely, this is not the sound of sudden revolution, it's the sound of history beginning to shift its weight. The end of an era rarely arrives with fire or thunder. More often, it begins like this, with a whisper, a glance, a silence that refuses to break. Today, that silence belongs to Russia's youth. Tomorrow, it may belong to the nation itself. To everyone following this story, understand, what's unfolding now will not be written in headlines, but in the quiet persistence of those who have stopped pretending. Stay with us, stay aware, and if you haven't already, subscribe, because when silence becomes a language, those who listen will be the first to recognize what comes next.